Hello, everyone. In Module 3, we will talk about intergovernmental fiscal relations and uh, also look at the importance of the comprehensive annual financial report. One of the primary key areas of importance for this particular module is to understand the value that we garner from the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, also known as a CAFR. The CAFR is generated at the end of the fiscal year. Actually, it is compiled after the fiscal year is over with. So it's a retrospective look at the finances of a government, in particular a local government. Although states do put together a CAFR as well. But in terms of this particular class, we're looking at local government CAFRs. And one of the reasons why this is done is so that obviously government can determine and see where they've spent their money, how they've been able to manage their resources, where they've actually spent those funds on, and the various types of funds that are included within the construction of the CAFR document. One of the important things that we'll discuss as we go forward throughout this quarter is the importance of the management discussion and analysis section within the CAFR, and that the MD&A, as it's referred to, allows the financial analysts, those in the finance department or the treasury department, to provide some qualitative information as to why their jurisdiction has spent money in such a fashion. Perhaps it allows them to give information to the bond rating agencies as to what their fiscal position is, and gives them an opportunity to explain that, and not just from a dollars and cents or a quantitative perspective. So you can ask yourself, why should governments complete the CAFR? It does provide us with a retrospective interpretation of the finances from that jurisdiction. Without that information, it becomes exceptionally hard to really understand where our money has been spent in that prior fiscal year. And a lot of times you'll see, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but there are occasions when you begin to look at a jurisdiction to perhaps do your research report on, a research paper on, and notice that their CAFR isn't available for a particular year. And that raises an issue. San Bernardino had this issue a few years ago, and it makes you question the veracity of the information that is provided in their CAFR. What are some of the reasons why they wouldn't actually provide this information online, or questions that come to mind? And this all gets back to the notion of fiscal relations, in some ways, fiscal cooperation. But the importance of intergovernmental fiscal relations really can be seen from a few different perspectives. So there is significant variation amongst local governments. You can just look at the cities that we live in the Inland Empire, and beyond that. Some cities have much more robust commercial enterprises and commercial real estate. Other cities may be what are considered bedroom communities, where a lot of the infrastructure and most of the infrastructure is outside of that city, and the majority of the individuals live there. But this variation is not only seen in the demographic makeup, but also primarily from the fiscal side of things, where their capacity to bring in additional revenue from sales tax perhaps may be much more available in a city like Rancho Cucamonga, as opposed to another city that doesn't have the commercial real estate that they do. Taking this a step further, there's obviously variation amongst the various states. Another important element of intergovernmental fiscal relations is public choice, because individuals have the free will to live where they want to, for the most part, based upon what they find important, what they feel is important. The the fiscal relationship or the fiscal capacity actually of those unique jurisdictions actually informs public choice, and in a lot of ways forces or makes certain areas more attractive to live, whereas other areas may not be as attractive. And then shortly we'll talk about this issue of vertical fiscal imbalance, as we're looking at the vertical scope, where the federal government obviously has the most financial resources, then followed by state governments, and then the last would be local governments, cities and counties. So there are two principles that I want to go into. And after reading the Mikesell reading, you should have an additional understanding of this. But the two principles are correspondence and subsidiarity. And the first principle, the correspondence principle, really gets to the idea of which level of government should provide services to the residents in their particular jurisdiction. And the way to kind of consider this or think about the correspondence principle is that the level of government, whether it's the federal government, state government, or local government, the level of government that should deliver those particular services and actually pay for the services that are delivered is the level of government whose residents are the actual beneficiaries of the services that are delivered. So when we look at our national or armed forces, the burden of that financial responsibility is really incumbent upon all Americans, all citizens, all residents, because national security is an issue that isn't just important in California or New York or Idaho, but across the United States. But when we look at issues related to, say, street cleaning or street sweeping or garbage pickup, the residents who are beneficiaries of garbage pickup are the residents of a particular city, right? So it makes sense, it corresponds to them that the local government actually pays for garbage pickup. It wouldn't make sense, it wouldn't make fiscal sense for the state government to pay for garbage pickup, because it would be much harder for the state of California to monitor garbage pickup in a smaller city, like Victorville or Colton. So the correspondence principle refers to the idea of who's going to actually benefit from that particular service. As I mentioned, another way to look at the correspondence principle is to think about it in terms of beneficiaries. And Mikesell says expenditure and service responsibilities should be aligned with the benefit areas for each government service. Now, when we turn our attention to the subsidiarity principle, it's very similar, but it has a different undertow. And really, the subsidiarity principle comes about from the notion that the lowest level of government that can possibly deliver the service effectively and efficiently should be the level of government that actually pays for that service delivery. So when we think about the subsidiarity principle, some things come to mind in terms of expenditures are financed locally. That way it enhances accountability and to some extent transparency. It internalizes the cost of providing particular services. And one of the main things that it promotes, or the benefit of the subsidiarity principle or following that principle, is that it promotes fiscal accountability. Oftentimes you hear the phrase economies of scale, and definition really looks at economies of scale exists if the unit cost per person served decreases as the size of the service unit increases. A couple of examples here are the post office or county sheriffs, where the cost decreases as the size of the service unit increases. So you'll notice that there aren't as many post offices as schools, but there aren't as many post offices because the services, mail delivery can be rendered and can be done pretty efficiently and effectively over a large area, a large service unit. thus decreasing the cost, the overall cost that is required to run mail delivery effectively and efficiently. So if you look at the cost of delivering a given level of fire protection is less for a 100,000 person service district than a 10,000 person service district. And that this particular example really looks at the idea that the proclivity or the amount of fires that are likely to occur are not as high. So the service area can be exceptionally broad and much larger. So let's turn our attention to tax system coordination. In terms of intergovernmental fiscal relations, fiscal management refers to government occasionally coordinating for a mutually beneficial purpose. So tax system coordination is geared or designed to assist the individual or the company. And the idea behind coordination is that government wants individuals to pay the taxes that are due, their appropriate level of taxes, what is expected of each individual or company, et cetera. And when the tax system is coordinated effectively and properly, then it makes it much easier for an individual or an organization or company to actually pay their taxes. When the system becomes much more complex and much more challenging, then you're more likely to have groups or individuals not paying their taxes, thus forcing the agency or the department to really go after the individual to recoup those taxes. And this adds extra time, extra resources that otherwise could be taken care of if there was better tax system coordination. So there are two primary areas of tax system coordination: relief in tax-based use and assistance with tax administration and compliance. Franchise Tax Board in California does the assistance with tax administration and compliance. It's an agency or department that really assists individuals in making sure that their taxes are paid properly, because the tax system can get convoluted, especially your income tax, when you have a business or an organization. And I think on the next slide there's a link to this. Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually down a bit. And in terms of tax system coordination, it becomes important to think about source separation, vertical overlapping and horizontal overlapping. And this type of overlapping occurs when a particular group or jurisdiction or level of government actually is taxed more than once. And there can be vertical overlapping where government at different levels apply tax to essentially the same group or the same base. When we think about our income taxes, we actually have to file a federal income tax and a state income tax. So the coordination is important between the federal government and state governments, because you don't want to have onerous taxes, which then result into individuals trying to skirt the system and not paying their taxes. And obviously, government wants to be fair to individuals, and it's not trying to recoup all money through taxes, but just a portion of the services that are delivered are covered through the taxes that are rendered. Horizontal overlapping looks at it from the same level of government, typically the local government, imposing a tax on the same base. So an example here would be when a city and a county both impose a sales tax. So both areas, both levels of government need to coordinate that so that, again, the taxes aren't onerous and that individuals aren't taxed at a high rate from the city while also being taxed at a high rate from the county as well. And here you can see the link to the California Franchise Tax Board. You see their mission is to provide the services and information to help taxpayers file accurate and timely tax returns and pay the proper amount owed. So again, you see this as being an area or an example where cooperation is designed to facilitate recovering and recouping the taxes that are rendered. So when we think about tax system coordination, again, some of the downsides are that it can be complicated. There are misunderstandings, confusion, and mistrust, and this all leads to a lack of compliance. And the tax system cooperation is designed to decrease those levels of misunderstanding, confusion, and complexity. So let's turn our attention to intergovernmental assistance. And in particular, we'll look at grants and two different types of grants. Grants transfer spending from one power or one level of government to another. Typically, you'll see federal grants made available to states. Sometimes states will make grants available to their local jurisdictions. Grant donors, and I think you've heard this term before, commonly referred to or have mandate strings attached to the grants, making you kind of dance to receive the money or the funds. There are four important aspects of fiscal assistance. What is the purpose of the grant? What's the purpose of the award? Who are the actual design recipients? What is the amount of the actual reward? And how will the funds be distributed? So in the reading this module, we see the Conlin article that discusses the emergence of the Kestenbaum Commission, some of the main themes that we're seeing there, what the Commission's recommendations were, and then how intergovernmental fiscal relations ultimately began to decline. So the Commission was convened by former President Dwight Eisenhower because of the complexity that he saw, where different levels of government were having a challenging time determining who should be responsible for delivering particular services. If you recall back to our understanding of the correspondence principle and the subsidiarity principle, those principles really emerged during this time period when there was a lack of clarity in determining which level of government would pay for a particular service that was delivered. And Eisenhower wanted to put together a group of individuals to kind of eliminate that confusion so that there would almost be a matrix or a roadmap to say that if this particular service was delivered, then this level of government would fund it. So when we think back to our national defense, obviously the beneficiaries are all the residents in the United States. So thus that is controlled or funded essentially from the federal level of government. And he wanted to have something in place that would really explain those situations whenever they occurred throughout the process of fiscal administration. But what the Commission determined and began to understand was that there needed to be a higher level of cooperation amongst the levels of government. So the federal government, state governments, and local governments should work together to develop some type of cooperation to understand how they can each work with each other. And then you saw, again, the emergence of these principles, the correspondence principle, et cetera. The decline of intergovernmental fiscal relations really emerged as our society and our country began to focus more heavily on the grants that could become available. And with the idea of various grants, these grants, because there are strings attached and there's money attached, they are by nature competitive. Every group, every agency, every individual is not likely to receive funding for a particular project. So it has become a situation where they are more competitive, thus making the competition between the states higher, competition amongst the local governments higher, and then decreasing the notion of cooperation between states or cooperation between local governments, and in large part due to the influx and the focus on grants and aid. So when we look at different types of grants, there are categorical grants and block grants. Categorical grants are very specific and narrow in their purpose. They may recall or require an agency to focus on a particular area of service delivery, whether that's one example would be modernizing education through innovation. A lot of times you'll see a grant made available to schools in California that have a significant focus on technology or innovation, and that automatically makes the grant much more specific and narrow, because it doesn't certainly apply to every school or the goal of every school. However, if the money that's available is significant enough, a lot of times the school, in this particular example, will shift their priorities and begin to think about being more innovative or more technologically driven. And that way they are able to be competitive and have a chance to receive the funds from the particular grant. This isn't the best case scenario or example for a potential recipient organization to follow, because again, it shifts their priorities and it gets away from their mission or their goals. Categorical grants are typically formula driven, and again, much more specific than the block grants. Block grants are another type of grant that is much more broad in its scope and purpose, and that's denotes the name block grant. They're typically distributed to general purpose governmental agencies, so it may be a grant that's awarded to a jurisdiction for something like public safety. So in that regard, obviously that falls under the guise of the police department or public safety officials, but it doesn't require that the recipient agency or organization follow a particular prescribed, very narrow cause. It could be public safety in terms of providing officers with better vests and equipment. It could be public safety in terms of providing individuals in the community with more information about being safe and safe neighborhoods. So it allows for a lot more flexibility. And typically, these types of grants, however, do not have as much funding associated with them. So we talked about the different types of grants and mandates in general are requirement from a higher level of government that a lower level of government perform. There are a couple of links here that I think you'll find interesting. In particular, the last link, intergovernmental relations, and it covers some of the things I just talked about, but also gives you some keen examples of the way that intergovernmental fiscal relations has declined over time. So let me know what you think about that, and look forward to talking to you soon about these issues, intergovernmental fiscal relations and block grants, and how our different levels of government do determine how to determine which level of government is going to pay for a particular service.